There's a word carved into clay tablets that are older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than almost anything else humans have ever built. That word is Anunnaki, and depending on who you ask, it either refers to the most powerful gods of the ancient world, or something far stranger that mainstream history has spent a century trying to keep quiet. Tonight, we're laying out the entire timeline, from the oldest clay tablets ever discovered to the modern theories that turned this ancient word into one of the most talked about mysteries on the internet. The entire Anunnaki timeline explained, and yes, we're not censoring any of it. Where the word Anunnaki actually comes from. The word Anunnaki first appears in Sumerian texts dating back roughly 4,500 years, making it one of the oldest religious terms ever recorded by human hands. In the Sumerian language, the word is generally understood to mean something close to those of royal blood, or princely offspring, a title that referred not to a single god, but to an entire category of divine beings considered to be the offspring of the sky god An and the earth goddess Kai. The exact spelling and pronunciation of this word actually varies somewhat across different surviving tablets, appearing in forms like Anunna, Anunnaku, and Anunnaki, depending on the specific city, scribe, and time period responsible for a given text. This kind of spelling variation is extremely common across ancient languages that were transmitted primarily through oral tradition before being standardized in writing, and it offers scholars a useful tool for roughly dating a given tablet based on which spelling convention it happens to use. Later Akkadian texts, composed by a Semitic-speaking population that eventually came to dominate the region after absorbing much of Sumerian religious and cultural tradition, generally preserved the term with only minor phonetic adjustments, a testament to just how deeply embedded this word had already become within Mesopotamian religious vocabulary by the time Akkadian speakers began recording their own version of these myths. This detail matters enormously because it tells us that Anunnaki was never meant to describe one specific figure. It was a collective term, similar to how we might use the word royalty to describe an entire family line rather than one particular king or queen. Any god who could trace their lineage back to An, the ancient sky father, could technically be counted among the Anunnaki, which explains why the term shows up attached to so many different deities across different Sumerian cities and different periods of history. This kind of flexible, collective divine terminology wasn't unique to the Anunnaki within Mesopotamian religion. Sumerian and later Babylonian texts frequently group gods together under broad umbrella terms depending on context, sometimes referring to the great gods, sometimes to the gods of heaven and earth, and sometimes to more specific councils convened for a particular narrative purpose within a given myth. What makes the Anunnaki distinctive is simply how consistently the term persisted across such an enormous span of time, remaining in active religious use for well over 2,000 years, despite the gradual and significant shifts in its precise meaning that we'll trace throughout the rest of this timeline. The earliest surviving references to the Anunnaki come from temple hymns and administrative records unearthed at sites like Nippur and Uruk, cities we'll be returning to throughout tonight's video. These early texts don't describe the Anunnaki as villains or as some kind of hidden conspiracy. They describe them as the supreme council of the gods, the ones whose decisions determine the fate of kings, cities, and the natural world itself. In this earliest layer of the historical record, being called Anunnaki was the highest honor a deity could receive, a title reserved for the gods considered powerful enough to sit in judgment over the cosmos. Some of these earliest inscriptions take the form of royal dedications, in which a Sumerian king records the construction or restoration of a temple and explicitly credits the Anunnaki with granting him the strength, wisdom, or military success necessary to complete the project. These dedications weren't simply expressions of gratitude, they served as a kind of ongoing contract between the ruler and the divine assembly, a public record establishing that the king's authority derived directly from this council of gods, and that any future ruler who failed to properly honour them risked losing that same divine favour. This pattern of royal inscriptions crediting the Anunnaki for military and architectural success continued, with only minor variation across literally thousands of years of Mesopotamian civilization, surviving the rise and fall of numerous empires, languages, and ruling dynasties. Over the centuries, as Sumerian civilization gave way to the Akkadian Empire and later to Babylon and Assyria, the meaning of the word Anunnaki began to shift in ways that are genuinely fascinating to trace. In some periods, it referred broadly to all the gods, both the great and the small. In other periods, particularly in later Babylonian texts, it became specifically associated with the gods of the underworld, the ones who judged the dead rather than the ones who walked freely through the heavens. This shift, from Supreme Divine Council to Judges of the Dead, is one of the most important developments in the entire timeline we're covering tonight, and it sets the stage for the version of the Anunnaki that most people are actually curious about when they search for this topic online. Scholars who specialize in tracing this kind of semantic drift across ancient languages point out that such shifts rarely happen suddenly or deliberately. Instead, they tend to accumulate gradually, as successive generations of scribes and priests, working in different cities with different local religious emphases, subtly reshape a term's connotation through the specific contexts in which they choose to use it. A scribe in one city composing a hymn praising the full assembly of the gods might use Anunnaki broadly, while a scribe in another city, composing a funerary text or a lament for the dead, might use the exact same word specifically to invoke the underworld judges, and over enough centuries, enough repetition, and enough cultural exchange between these different centers of religious authority, the narrower usage can eventually come to dominate the broader one almost entirely. But before we get to the underworld, before we get to the theories about ancient astronauts and hidden alien history that have made this word famous in modern times, we need to understand who these gods actually were according to the oldest texts ever written about them. And that story begins in a city so old that its own inhabitants believed it had existed since before the Great Flood itself. The original council, An, Enlil, and Enki. At the very top of the earliest version of the Anunnaki sat three figures whose authority stretched across the entire Sumerian world. The first was An, sometimes called Anu in later Akkadian texts, the god of the sky itself, and wasn't a particularly active character in the myths that survive. He rarely appears taking direct action or intervening in the affairs of mortals. Instead, he functioned as the ultimate source of legitimacy, the being whose approval was required before any other god or any human king could claim real authority. His main temple stood in the ancient city of Uruk, one of the very first true cities ever built by human beings, and archaeologists digging beneath its ruins have found layers of religious architecture stretching back over 5,000 years. The scale of Uruk itself helps explain why An's blessing carried such enormous weight throughout the Anunnaki timeline. At its height, the city may have housed tens of thousands of residents behind massive walls that later legend credited to the hero King Gilgamesh, making it one of the largest urban centers anywhere on the planet during that early period of human history. A settlement of that size required some kind of unifying authority to prevent it from collapsing into constant internal conflict, and An, as the distant but ultimate source of legitimate power among the Anunnaki, provided exactly that kind of foundational stability, even as more active gods increasingly handled the practical, day-to-day business of governing both the divine and mortal worlds beneath him. Below An in authority, though arguably more active in the surviving myths, was Enlil, the god of air, wind, and storms. Enlil's temple stood in the city of Nippur, which the Sumerians considered the spiritual center of their entire civilization, regardless of which city held actual political power at any given time. Enlil's personality across the surviving tablets is complicated and, frankly, unsettling in places. He's credited with teaching humanity agriculture and the use of tools, but he's also the god responsible for one of the most devastating stories in the entire Anunnaki timeline: the decision to flood the earth and wipe out humanity entirely. Nippur's unique status within Mesopotamian religion deserves a moment of its own attention, since it illustrates something distinctive about how the Anunnaki's authority actually functioned in practice. Unlike most Sumerian cities, Nippur rarely if ever served as an actual seat of political power, ruled instead by whichever dynasty happened to control the wider region at a given moment. And yet every legitimate Sumerian king, regardless of which city he actually governed from, felt compelled to make offerings and demonstrate devotion at Nippur's temple to Enlil, since failing to secure this specific god's blessing was believed to render any claim to kingship fundamentally illegitimate in the eyes of the wider Anunnaki assembly. This arrangement, political power concentrated in one place while ultimate religious legitimacy remained fixed in another, gave Sumerian civilization a surprisingly stable religious center, even as its political capital shifted repeatedly across the centuries between cities like Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and Kish. This arrangement bears an interesting resemblance to certain modern political systems in which a ceremonial capital or a specific institution retains symbolic authority even as practical governance is exercised elsewhere, and it likely served a genuinely stabilizing function for Sumerian civilization as a whole. Rather than each rising city needing to construct an entirely new religious framework to justify its own political dominance, ambitious rulers could simply seek recognition from Nippur's existing, well-established priesthood, inserting themselves into an already legitimate and widely respected chain of divine authority, rather than attempting the far more difficult task of establishing an entirely new religious basis for their rule from scratch. Archaeological evidence from Nippur itself supports this picture of continuous religious significance, despite fluctuating political fortunes, showing a temple complex that was maintained, expanded, and actively used across a span of literally thousands of years, even during periods when the city's own political and economic influence had clearly diminished relative to its more powerful neighbors. According to the oldest surviving flood narrative, predating the biblical story of Noah by well over 1,000 years, Enlil grew frustrated with the growing noise and population of the human race and convinced the assembly of the Anunnaki to support a plan to destroy them completely through a catastrophic deluge. The plan was carried out in near total secrecy, with every member of the Divine Council swearing an oath not to warn any human being about what was coming. It's worth pausing on just how unanimous this decision actually was, according to the surviving text. This wasn't Enlil acting alone as some kind of rogue, vengeful deity. Every major god in the Anunnaki assembly, including figures we haven't discussed yet tonight, agreed to this plan and swore themselves to secrecy regarding it. This detail complicates any simple attempt to divide the Anunnaki cleanly into good gods and bad gods. The eventual decision by one member of this same council to break the oath and save humanity anyway represents a genuinely dramatic act of individual conscience, overriding a decision the full assembly had already reached together. That secrecy was broken by the third major figure in this original council, a god named Enki, ruler of the fresh waters and widely regarded as the wisest and most cunning of all the Anunnaki. Enki couldn't bring himself to let humanity die without warning, but rather than breaking his oath outright, he found a loophole. He spoke not to a human directly, but to the wall of a reed hut, knowing that a man named Ziusudra was resting on the other side and would overhear every word. Through that wall, Enki described the coming flood in exact detail and gave precise instructions for building a boat that could survive it, complete with measurements, sealing methods, and a plan for preserving both animals and human knowledge. This technicality, speaking to a wall rather than directly to a person, might seem like a thin excuse to modern readers, but it reflects something genuinely important about how the Sumerians understood oaths and divine speech. Words spoken by a god carried a kind of binding, almost magical force in Mesopotamian religious thought, and the specific formal wording of a vow mattered enormously, sometimes more than the underlying intention behind it. Enki's clever workaround wasn't viewed by the original audience as a form of cheating or dishonesty. It was viewed as a display of genuine wisdom, finding a way to honor the letter of an oath while still fulfilling a deeper moral obligation to protect innocent life, a quality that made Enki one of the most consistently beloved figures across the entire Anunnaki pantheon. This same reverence for the precise, literal wording of oaths and divine pronouncements recurs throughout Mesopotamian legal and religious tradition more broadly, extending well beyond this single flood narrative. Contracts, treaties, and formal agreements throughout Mesopotamian history were frequently sworn specifically in the names of particular Anunnaki deities, with the exact phrasing of these oaths considered legally and spiritually binding in a way that closely parallels how modern legal systems treat the precise wording of a signed contract. Breaking an oath sworn in a god's name wasn't simply a moral failing according to this worldview. It was believed to invite direct, tangible divine punishment, making the specific god invoked in any given oath a matter of genuine practical importance rather than a mere formality, since different Anunnaki deities were understood to enforce their own sworn oaths with varying degrees of severity, depending on their individual character and domain. The flood came exactly as described, a catastrophe lasting 6 days and 7 nights so violent that even the gods who unleashed it were reportedly horrified by what they witnessed from above. When the waters finally receded and Ziusudra's boat came to rest, Enlil discovered that humanity had survived after all, and for a tense moment in the story, it seems as though he might try to finish the job entirely. Instead, confronted by Enki and by the offerings the surviving humans immediately made out of gratitude, Enlil relented, granted Ziusudra immortality, and accepted that humanity would continue to exist, provided its numbers remained naturally limited by disease, famine, and other harsh realities of mortal life. This flood story isn't just an interesting piece of ancient literature, it's direct proof of just how old and how influential the concept of the Anunnaki actually is, since scholars widely agree that this Sumerian account, along with its later Babylonian retelling in the Epic of Gilgamesh, almost certainly influenced the flood narrative that eventually appeared in the Book of Genesis, meaning the Anunnaki's fingerprints are quite literally embedded in one of the most widely read religious texts in human history. The Babylonian retelling of this flood story within the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood hero is named Utnapishtim rather than Ziusudra, adds a detail that makes the emotional weight of that night even more vivid, describing the goddess Ishtar wailing in genuine regret once she witnessed the scale of devastation unfolding beneath her, comparing herself in her grief to a mother mourning her own children, despite having initially supported the plan to destroy humanity. This detail, carried forward from the older Sumerian tradition into the later Babylonian version, reinforces just how seriously Mesopotamian religion took the idea that even divine decisions could carry consequences the gods themselves hadn't fully anticipated or emotionally prepared for. With this foundational trio established, the timeline of the Anunnaki takes its next major turn in a direction that most people researching this topic today have never actually heard about. A rebellion among the lower-ranking gods that would ultimately lead to the creation of humanity itself. the rebellion that created humanity. To understand this next chapter of the timeline, we need to introduce a second category of divine beings that appears alongside the Anunnaki in many surviving texts, a group known as the Igigi. While the Anunnaki generally represented the senior, ruling gods, the Igigi were often described as a lower tier of deities, tasked with the actual physical labor required to maintain creation itself. The precise relationship between the Anunnaki and the Igigi has been debated among scholars for decades, since different tablets seem to draw the line between these two groups slightly differently, and some later texts appear to use the terms almost interchangeably. What remains consistent across nearly every version of this story, however, is the basic social structure it describes. A smaller group of senior, ruling gods overseeing a much larger population of subordinate deities responsible for the physical maintenance of the world, a hierarchy that mirrors, quite deliberately, the actual social structure of Mesopotamian civilization itself, where a small ruling class of kings, priests, and nobles governed a much larger population of laborers, farmers, and craftsmen. Some later Babylonian texts suggest the Igigi eventually came to be understood as a heavenly rather than earthly category of deity, in some ways paralleling how the term Anunnaki itself gradually shifted toward the underworld judges we'll discuss shortly, reflecting the same kind of gradual semantic drift that affected numerous other terms across this long and continuously evolving religious tradition. This fluidity between categories, rather than representing sloppy or inconsistent theology, likely reflects how genuinely alive and actively used this religious vocabulary remained across literally thousands of years of continuous practice, with each new generation of priests and scribes adapting inherited terminology to fit their own city's specific religious emphasis and their own era's particular theological concerns. According to a Babylonian text known as the Atrahasis Epic, which draws heavily on much older Sumerian source material, the Igigi were assigned the exhausting, backbreaking work of digging canals and irrigation channels across the earth, work that had to continue endlessly under the blazing heat of the Mesopotamian sun. For decades, according to the story, the Igigi labored without complaint, piling up mountains of excavated earth, maintaining the rivers that made agriculture possible for the world above. Eventually, their patience ran out. The text describes the Igigi setting down their tools in unison, gathering together and marching on Enlil's own temple in open rebellion, weapons in hand, refusing to continue their labor for even one more day. This wasn't a minor disagreement. It was a genuine uprising within the divine hierarchy, serious enough that the senior members of the Anunnaki convened an emergency council to figure out how to respond. The text describing this confrontation captures a surprising amount of genuine tension and uncertainty among the senior gods, who initially considered responding with direct force before ultimately recognizing that violently suppressing the rebellion would simply leave them without any labor force at all going forward, since presumably killing or punishing the Igigi wouldn't magically make the canals dig themselves. This practical, almost administrative concern, rather than any grand moral realization, appears to have been the deciding factor that pushed the assembly toward considering an entirely new solution instead. It was Enki who proposed the solution that would ultimately define the rest of human history. Rather than punishing the Igigi or forcing them back to work, he suggested creating an entirely new class of being, one specifically designed to take over the burden of labor and free the Igigi from their endless toil. That new being would be humanity, and according to the myth, humans were formed from a mixture of clay and the blood of a slain god, specifically one of the Igigi ringleaders who had instigated the rebellion in the first place. This detail is worth sitting with for a moment because it frames humanity's entire purpose in the Anunnaki timeline in strikingly transactional terms. We weren't created as beloved children born out of pure affection. We were created as a labor force, engineered specifically to dig canals, farm fields, and build temples so that the gods above could enjoy comfort and leisure. This origin story, harsh as it sounds by modern standards, was taken completely seriously by the civilizations who told it, and it forms the bedrock of almost every later Mesopotamian creation myth, including the more famous Babylonian version we're about to cover next. The specific detail of using the slain god's blood as an ingredient in humanity's creation carries additional symbolic weight that ancient audiences would have understood immediately, even if it strikes modern readers as unusually gruesome. According to the surviving text, this particular god was chosen specifically because he was identified as having possessed intelligence, or perhaps simply a rebellious spirit, and mixing his blood into the clay was believed to pass some portion of that same quality directly into humanity's fundamental nature. Some interpretations of this myth suggest the Sumerians used this detail to explain a genuinely puzzling aspect of the human condition as they understood it. Why humans, unlike the domesticated animals they relied upon for agriculture, seemed permanently restless, ambitious, and prone to questioning the authority placed over them, a trait the myth traces directly back to the rebellious god whose blood had supposedly been mixed into the very clay from which the first humans were shaped. The actual physical act of creation, according to the Atrahasis epic, was carried out by a birth goddess referred to in the text as Nintu, sometimes identified with the mother goddess Ninhursag. We'll return to later tonight, who kneaded the mixture of clay and divine blood and formed the first 14 human beings, 7 male and 7 female, pinching off portions of the mixture in a manner the text compares directly to the process of making bricks, a comparison that would have resonated deeply with a civilization whose entire architectural tradition depended on mud brick construction. This detail reinforces just how thoroughly practical and grounded in everyday Mesopotamian experience even the most cosmic and consequential myths in this entire tradition actually were. Describing the creation of humanity itself, using the same basic craft terminology a Sumerian builder might use to describe constructing a house or a temple wall. Because as Sumerian civilization gave way to the rise of Babylon, an entirely new god would step forward, claim authority over the Anunnaki himself, and reorganize the very structure of divine power in a way that would define Mesopotamian religion for the next 1,000 years. Marduk and the reorganization of the gods. By the time Babylon rose to dominance over the older Sumerian cities, a new god named Marduk had emerged as the central figure of Mesopotamian religion, and his rise to power is described in one of the most dramatic creation epics ever recorded, a text known as the Enuma Elish. This story doesn't just explain how the universe was created, it explains how Marduk specifically earned the right to command the Anunnaki themselves. The Enuma Elish itself was composed relatively late compared to the older Sumerian material we've discussed so far, likely sometime during the second millennium before the Common Era, and it was recited annually during Babylon's most important religious festival, an event called Akitu, celebrated at the start of the new year. During this festival, priests would recite the entire epic from beginning to end, and the reigning Babylonian king would participate in a ritual specifically designed to renew his own legitimacy in the eyes of Marduk and the assembled Anunnaki, a practice that continued for well over 1,000 years and represents one of the longest continuously performed religious rituals in recorded human history. According to the epic, the cosmos was originally threatened by a primeval goddess of chaos named Tiamat, often described as a monstrous, dragon-like being representing the untamed, salty waters of the sea, in contrast to the fresh waters governed by Enki. When Tiamat, enraged by the younger gods disturbing the ancient order of things, assembled an army of monsters and prepared to destroy the divine assembly entirely, None of the senior gods, not even Enlil, felt confident enough to face her directly. The specific list of monsters Tiamat assembles for this battle is described in vivid, almost gleeful detail across the surviving tablets, including serpents dripping with venom, scorpion men, ferocious storm demons, and hybrid creatures combining features of lions, dogs, and humans into single terrifying forms. This catalogue of horrors served a clear narrative purpose, establishing just how overwhelming and unprecedented this threat truly was, making the eventual solution, a single young god volunteering to face this entire army essentially alone, feel appropriately dramatic and consequential to the original audience hearing this story recited during the New Year festival. Tiamat's own motivation for assembling this army deserves a moment of attention as well, since the text frames her not simply as an arbitrary force of chaos, but as a genuinely aggrieved figure responding to a specific provocation. According to the epic, the younger generation of gods, restless and increasingly active within the still-forming cosmos, disturbed Tiamat's ancient rest through their constant movement and noise, echoing, in miniature, the exact same complaint that would later drive Enlil to attempt the destruction of humanity through the Great Flood. This recurring theme, older or more established beings within the Anunnaki, growing frustrated with the disruptive energy of younger generations, whether divine or human, threads its way through multiple major myths across this entire tradition, suggesting it reflected a genuinely persistent theological preoccupation within Mesopotamian religious thought regarding the tension between established order and the disruptive energy of new growth. It was Marduk, a younger god, who agreed to fight Tiamat on one condition: that if he succeeded, the entire assembly of gods would recognize him as their supreme ruler, above even An and Enlil. The gods, desperate and out of options, agreed. The battle that followed is described in the text with genuine cosmic scale, Marduk riding into combat armed with lightning, a net to entangle his enemy, and the four winds at his command. He ultimately defeated Tiamat, splitting her massive body in two to form the heavens and the earth, and using the remains of her monstrous army to fashion the stars and other features of the created world. Following his victory, Marduk didn't simply accept the throne and move on. He fundamentally reorganized the entire divine hierarchy, assigning specific stations and duties to the Anunnaki, essentially rewriting the chain of command that had governed Mesopotamian religion since the earliest Sumerian texts. According to the epic, Marduk divided the Anunnaki into two groups, 300 assigned to the heavens and 300 assigned to the earth and underworld, a level of numerical specificity that later Babylonian scribes and astronomers took seriously enough to reference in their own calculations of cosmic order. In gratitude, or perhaps in a display of newfound loyalty, the Anunnaki themselves are described as building Marduk a magnificent temple complex in Babylon called the Esagila, a structure so significant that it would remain one of the most important religious sites in the ancient world for well over 1,000 years afterward. The famous ziggurat associated with this temple complex, known as Etemenanki, is widely believed by scholars to be the historical and cultural inspiration behind the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, another striking example of just how deeply the Anunnaki timeline is woven into the foundations of later religious tradition. The Enuma Elish closes with an extraordinary passage in which the assembled Anunnaki formally bestow 50 separate names upon Marduk, each one representing a specific divine attribute, power, or historical association absorbed from an earlier god within the pantheon. This lengthy recitation of names effectively consolidated the identities and functions of numerous older Anunnaki deities directly into Marduk himself, a theological maneuver that allowed Babylonian priests to present their patron god as the fulfillment and culmination of the entire prior religious tradition rather than as a jarring replacement for it. Reciting all 50 names correctly during temple ceremonies was considered an act of genuine religious devotion and scholarly achievement, and several surviving commentary tablets exist specifically to explain the meaning and origin of each individual name for the benefit of priests and students studying the text. The numerical precision found throughout the Enuma Elish, including the specific division of the Anunnaki into 300 assigned to the heavens and 300 assigned to the earth, reflects a broader Babylonian fascination with numerical and astronomical symmetry that eventually gave rise to one of that civilization's most enduring intellectual legacies, the sexagesimal, or base 60, number system, which survives today in how we divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. Babylonian priest astronomers, the same scholars responsible for maintaining temples dedicated to various Anunnaki deities, developed sophisticated mathematical and astronomical traditions specifically to track the movements of celestial bodies believed to correspond to these gods, eventually developing the 12-part zodiac system that continues to influence astrological practice around the world today, a direct and continuously traceable line running from ancient Anunnaki temple observation to a system still referenced in newspapers and phone applications more than 2,000 years later. This reorganization under Marduk represents one of the most significant political and religious transitions in the entire history of the Anunnaki, and it's worth pointing out just how directly this story reflects Babylon's actual historical rise to political dominance over cities like Nippur and Uruk that had previously held religious primacy for well over 1,000 years. Myths like the Enuma Elish rarely emerge from purely abstract theological speculation. They tend to reflect and justify real political developments happening on the ground, and Marduk's dramatic elevation above An and Enlil within this specific text corresponds directly with Babylon's own dramatic rise from a minor regional settlement into the most powerful city in the entire ancient Near East. As Mesopotamian religious thought continued to develop, the term Anunnaki itself would undergo yet another transformation, one that shifted its meaning away from the shining gods of heaven and towards something far darker, something connected directly to death, judgment, and the fate of every soul who had ever lived. The Anunnaki as judges of the dead. In later Mesopotamian texts, particularly those describing the underworld, the term Anunnaki narrows significantly, referring specifically to a council of 7 judges who presided over the realm of the dead alongside its ruler, a goddess named Ereshkigal. This shift is crucial to understanding why the word Anunnaki carries such an ominous, mysterious weight in modern popular culture, since this darker association with death and judgment is what many later interpretations latched onto. The number 7 itself carried significant symbolic weight throughout Mesopotamian religious thought more broadly, appearing repeatedly across myths involving gates, judgments, and cosmic structure, and its specific application to this council of underworld judges reinforced the sense that their rulings represented a kind of complete, comprehensive, and final form of justice, one that covered every possible angle of a soul's conduct during their mortal life. Unlike human courts, which the Sumerians understood to be fallible and subject to bribery or manipulation, this council of 7 Anunnaki judges was consistently portrayed as beyond any form of corruption or negotiation. This same symbolic weight attached to the number 7 recurs across an enormous range of Mesopotamian religious contexts beyond just the underworld judges, appearing in the 7 gates of the underworld itself that Inanna had to pass through, in various demon-banishing incantations that invoke groups of 7 evil spirits requiring exorcism, and in astronomical contexts referencing the 7 visible celestial bodies known to Babylonian observers, the sun, moon, and 5 visible planets, a celestial grouping that eventually gave rise to the 7-day week still used around the world today. This consistent, deliberate use of the number 7 across such a wide range of otherwise unrelated religious and astronomical contexts suggests it functioned as a kind of foundational organizing principle within Mesopotamian cosmology more broadly, representing completeness and totality in a way that made its application to the underworld judges feel entirely natural and appropriately weighty to worshippers steeped in this same broader symbolic tradition. The most detailed surviving account of these underworld judges appears in the myth of Inanna's descent, a story describing how the goddess of love and war attempted to claim dominion over the underworld and was struck down by her own sister. According to the myth, when Inanna finally stood before Ereshkigal, stripped of every symbol of power and status through a series of 7 gates, it was the Anunnaki who fixed her with what the tablets describe as the look of death itself, and it was their unanimous judgment that condemned her, transforming her body into a lifeless corpse hung upon a wall. This portrayal of the Anunnaki as absolute merciless judges, capable of striking down even a powerful goddess without appeal or mercy, reflects a broader Mesopotamian belief that the underworld operated according to fixed, unbreakable laws that applied to everyone, regardless of rank or status. Kings and paupers, gods and mortals, all eventually stood before this same council, and its rulings, according to every surviving account, could never be overturned or negotiated. Interestingly, these underworld Anunnaki were not universally depicted as purely evil or malicious. Some later prayers and incantations actually appeal to them for protection against demons and malevolent spirits, suggesting that Mesopotamian worshippers understood the Anunnaki less as villains and more as strict, impartial enforcers of cosmic law, frightening precisely because they were so consistent and so impossible to bribe or deceive, not because they took any particular pleasure in cruelty. Surviving funerary texts and burial inscriptions from across the later Mesopotamian period frequently invoke these same underworld judges directly, with grieving families requesting that the deceased receive fair and merciful treatment before this council, a practice that closely parallels how modern religious traditions might request divine mercy or judgment on behalf of someone who has passed away. This continuity of practice across literally thousands of years of religious tradition, invoking essentially the same council of divine judges from the earliest Sumerian burial customs through to the final centuries of Babylonian and Assyrian civilization, represents one of the longest unbroken religious practices ever documented anywhere in the ancient world. By the time we reach the very end of the Babylonian period, the word Anunnaki had accumulated centuries of shifting meaning, referring at various points to the entire pantheon, the ruling council of great gods, and finally the 7 judges of the dead. For nearly 3,000 years, this was the complete and accepted understanding of who the Anunnaki actually were, preserved on clay tablets that were eventually buried, forgotten, and left untouched for millennia as the great cities of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon crumbled into dust and disappeared beneath the desert sand. And that might have been the end of the story entirely, if not for a series of remarkable archaeological discoveries in the 19th century that would eventually bring the word Anunnaki back into public consciousness, setting the stage for one of the strangest and most controversial reinterpretations of ancient history that the modern world has ever produced. The rediscovery buried beneath the sand. For roughly 2,000 years, the cities of Sumer and Babylon existed only as vague references in the Bible and in the writings of a handful of ancient Greek historians who described Babylon's legendary walls and hanging gardens without any archaeological evidence to confirm the details. The actual physical remains of these civilizations, along with the hundreds of thousands of clay tablets recording their religion, laws, and daily life, remained buried and completely unknown to the modern world. Greek and Roman authors, writing centuries after the fall of Babylon, preserved fragmentary and often garbled accounts of Mesopotamian history, sometimes drawing on the work of a Babylonian priest named Berossus, who composed a history of his own civilization in Greek during the 3rd century before the Common Era, specifically to explain his people's traditions to a wider Hellenistic audience. Berossus's original work has been lost, surviving only through quotations preserved by later authors, but it apparently included its own version of the flood narrative and references to legendary pre-flood kings that align remarkably closely with the Sumerian king list we discussed earlier, offering a fascinating, if incomplete, thread connecting the ancient Mesopotamian tradition directly to the classical Mediterranean world, centuries before European archaeologists ever set foot in Iraq. Berossus reportedly wrote his history specifically at the request of Hellenistic rulers governing Babylon following the conquests of Alexander the Great, hoping to preserve and properly explain his own civilization's ancient traditions to a new ruling class largely unfamiliar with Mesopotamian religion and history. Though his complete original work is lost, the surviving quotations and summaries preserved by later Greek and Roman authors, including references to specific pre-flood kings and their improbably long reigns, demonstrate that at least some fragmentary knowledge of the genuine Sumerian and Babylonian religious tradition persisted in scholarly circles for centuries after the fall of the last independent Mesopotamian kingdoms, even as the actual cuneiform script itself gradually fell out of active use and eventually disappeared from living memory entirely. That changed dramatically in the middle of the 19th century, when European archaeologists and explorers began excavating major sites across what is now Iraq. Figures like Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam uncovered the ruins of ancient Nineveh, Nimrud, and eventually Nippur and Uruk, unearthing entire libraries of cuneiform tablets that had lain undisturbed since the collapse of Mesopotamian civilization. Among these discoveries was the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, which contained thousands of tablets including multiple copies of the flood narrative and the Enuma Elish itself. Layard's early excavations at Nimrud and Nineveh, beginning in the 1840s, uncovered massive stone reliefs and colossal winged bull statues that caused an immediate sensation when shipped back to European museums, introducing the general public for the first time to tangible, monumental evidence of the civilizations described only vaguely in the Bible up to that point. Rassam, who had worked closely alongside Layard before eventually leading his own excavations, is specifically credited with the discovery of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, a find that would prove far more significant to our understanding of the Anunnaki than any of the impressive stone monuments recovered during these same early campaigns, since the thousands of clay tablets contained within that single library preserved more actual religious and literary text than all the physical statuary combined. These early excavations were conducted under conditions that would strike modern archaeologists as remarkably crude by today's professional standards, with excavators often digging quickly and somewhat destructively in search of impressive monumental artifacts suitable for museum display back in Europe, sometimes at the expense of the careful, methodical, stratigraphic recording that modern archaeology considers essential for properly understanding a site's history. Despite these limitations, the sheer volume of material recovered during this period was staggering, and it laid the essential groundwork for every subsequent generation of Mesopotamian scholarship that followed. The process of actually translating cuneiform script took decades of painstaking scholarly work, since the writing system itself had been completely forgotten for well over 2,000 years. It wasn't until the 1870s that a British museum scholar named George Smith successfully translated the flood tablet from the Epic of Gilgamesh, causing a genuine sensation when audiences realized just how closely this ancient Mesopotamian flood story resembled the biblical account of Noah, a story most 19th century readers had assumed was entirely unique to the Bible. Smith's announcement of this discovery, delivered before the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London in 1872, reportedly caused such excitement that he was funded to travel personally to the site of Nineveh in search of the missing fragments needed to complete the translation, and remarkably, according to widely repeated accounts of the expedition, he succeeded in locating additional relevant tablet fragments within days of beginning his search, a discovery so improbable that it remains one of the most celebrated moments in the entire history of archaeological fieldwork. As more and more tablets were translated over the following decades, scholars slowly reconstructed the outline of the Anunnaki's history that we've covered so far tonight, piecing together fragments from different cities, different time periods, and different versions of the same myths to build a coherent picture of ancient Mesopotamian religion. This was a genuinely remarkable achievement of careful, methodical scholarship, requiring fluency in extinct languages and a deep familiarity with archaeology, linguistics, and comparative religion. But it was precisely this newly translated, still relatively obscure body of ancient text that would eventually catch the attention of a very different kind of researcher in the 20th century, one whose interpretation of the Anunnaki would have absolutely nothing to do with traditional archaeology, and everything to do with a claim that would make the word Anunnaki instantly recognizable to millions of people who had never even heard of Sumer. The theory that changed everything, Zecharia Sitchin. In 1976, an author named Zecharia Sitchin published a book called The 12th Planet, the first in a series that would eventually be known as the Earth Chronicles. Sitchin, who had studied economic history and had a background in journalism rather than in Assyriology or ancient Near Eastern languages, put forward a theory that would completely transform how millions of people around the world understood the word Anunnaki. Sitchin's background is worth noting honestly, since it directly informed how his work was eventually received by the professional academic community. He was born in Azerbaijan, raised primarily in Palestine and later Israel, and studied economics and history at the University of London before working for many years as a journalist and editor. His fluency in Hebrew and his self-taught familiarity with ancient Near Eastern languages gave him genuine, if largely informal, exposure to the primary source material, but he lacked the specific, rigorous training in Sumerian and Akkadian grammar that professional Assyriologists spend years developing, a gap that would become central to later criticism of his specific translations. This particular combination, genuine passion and self-directed study alongside a lack of formal, peer-reviewed training in the specific grammatical structures of these extinct languages, is a pattern that recurs across numerous alternative history movements more broadly, and it's worth understanding why this specific combination tends to produce work that mainstream specialists find difficult to accept, even when the underlying enthusiasm for the source material is entirely genuine. Sumerian and Akkadian grammar involves highly specific verbal structures, case systems, and vocabulary usage patterns that shift meaningfully across different historical periods and different regional dialects, nuances that typically require years of supervised, systematic study to master reliably, since even small grammatical misreadings can substantially change the meaning of an entire passage in ways that aren't always obvious to a reader working primarily from translated dictionaries rather than original grammatical training. According to Sitchin's interpretation, the Anunnaki were not gods in any symbolic or religious sense at all. They were, in his reading of the ancient texts, literal extraterrestrial beings from a planet he called Nibiru, which he claimed followed a massive, elongated orbit around our Sun, passing through the inner solar system only once every 3,600 years. Sitchin argued that these beings first arrived on Earth several 100,000 years ago, seeking gold to repair their home planet's damaged atmosphere, and that they eventually genetically engineered early hominids by combining their own DNA with that of existing primates, creating modern humans specifically to serve as a labor force for mining operations. Sitchin developed this core premise across 7 main books published over more than 2 decades, gradually adding additional detail and expanding the scope of his claims to cover not just Mesopotamian mythology, but also Egyptian religion, biblical narratives, and even the geological history of the solar system itself. He proposed that Nibiru's periodic passage through the inner solar system was itself responsible for catastrophic events in Earth's deep past, including, in some of his later work, a proposed ancient collision that he claimed explained the formation of the asteroid belt. This claim, as dramatic as it sounds, was presented by Sitchin as a direct, literal translation of the very same Sumerian and Akkadian texts we've been discussing throughout this video, including the Atrahasis Epic's account of the Igigis' labor rebellion and the subsequent creation of humanity from clay and divine blood. Sitchin argued that ancient peoples, lacking the scientific vocabulary to describe advanced technology, simply described spacecraft as flying chariots, genetic engineering as divine creation, and extraterrestrial visitors as gods, and that generations of mainstream translators had either misunderstood or deliberately obscured these literal meanings. Sitchin's book sold millions of copies and inspired an enormous and enduring subculture of ancient astronaut theorists, a movement that gained even wider mainstream visibility decades later through television programs exploring similar ideas across dozens of ancient sites and civilizations around the world. For many people today, their very first exposure to the word Anunnaki comes not from a university course on Mesopotamian religion, but from this specific theory linking the term to extraterrestrial visitors, genetic engineering, and a hidden planet in our solar system. It's important, in the interest of remaining completely factual, to address directly how this theory has been received by the scholars who actually specialize in reading these ancient languages. The overwhelming consensus among professional Assyriologists, linguists, and archaeologists is that Sitchin's translations contain fundamental and consistent errors, and that his interpretation of specific Sumerian and Akkadian words does not hold up under rigorous linguistic analysis. The most frequently cited example involves the very name Sitchin translated as Nibiru. In actual Mesopotamian astronomical texts, the term Sitchin associated with this supposed hidden planet appears to refer to a point in the sky associated with the planet Jupiter, used as a marker for calculating the calendar, rather than any description of a distant, undiscovered world following an unusual multi-thousand-year orbit. Scholars who have reviewed the primary source material point out that Sitchin's translations frequently rely on outdated dictionaries, cherry-picked fragments taken out of their original context, and interpretations that don't match how these specific words and phrases are used consistently across the wider body of surviving Sumerian and Akkadian literature. Specific criticism from professional Assyriologists has focused heavily on Sitchin's handling of specialized vocabulary describing celestial bodies and mathematical calculations found on tablets dealing with Mesopotamian astronomy and astrology. Scholars specializing in this particular body of texts point out that Babylonian astronomers were remarkably precise and mathematically sophisticated for their era, tracking planetary movements with genuine accuracy for practical purposes like agricultural timing and religious festival scheduling, but that nothing in this substantial body of astronomical literature describes an additional planet beyond those visible to the naked eye, nor does it describe any celestial body following the kind of extreme, elongated orbital pattern central to Sitchin's theory. Beyond the specific translation issues, professional astronomers have also noted that a planet following the kind of extreme, elongated orbit Sitchin described would be gravitationally unstable and essentially undetectable using any method that hasn't already ruled out its existence, and no credible astronomical evidence has ever been found to support the existence of such a planet within our solar system. Modern searches for undiscovered planetary bodies in the outer solar system, driven by legitimate astronomical questions entirely unrelated to Sitchin's work, have continued for decades using increasingly sophisticated telescopes and orbital tracking methods, and none of this ongoing, methodologically rigorous research has produced any evidence supporting the specific characteristics Sitchin attributed to Nibiru. None of this is meant to suggest that the actual Anunnaki, as described in the genuine ancient texts we spent the first half of this video exploring, are any less fascinating than Sitchin's alternative version. If anything, the real documented history, an evolving religious concept that shifted from supreme sky gods to underworld judges over the course of 3,000 years of continuous civilization, arguably tells us far more about how ancient people actually understood their world than a theory built on contested translations ever could. What Babylonian astronomers actually recorded. It's worth taking a genuine detour here into what Babylonian astronomers actually did record, since their real documented achievements are honestly just as impressive as anything claimed by the Nibiru theory, and arguably more remarkable precisely because they're verifiably true. Babylonian priests and scholars maintained systematic astronomical observations for centuries, recording the positions of the moon, sun, and visible planets with a level of mathematical precision that wouldn't be matched again in some respects until many centuries later in other parts of the world. Surviving Babylonian astronomical diaries, some spanning periods of several hundred years through continuous methodical record-keeping, passed down across generations of scribes, tracked lunar eclipses, planetary conjunctions, and the length of each month with genuine mathematical rigor, allowing Babylonian astronomers to develop increasingly accurate methods for predicting future celestial events, including eclipses, well in advance. This body of astronomical data was so extensive and so precise that later Greek astronomers, including figures whose work would eventually influence the entire Western tradition of mathematical astronomy, directly drew upon Babylonian observational records that had already been maintained for centuries by the time Greek scholars gained access to them. This genuine, well-documented astronomical sophistication is precisely why professional astronomers find the specific claims surrounding Nibiru so difficult to reconcile with the actual observational record. If Babylonian astronomers were meticulous enough to track and mathematically predict lunar eclipses centuries in advance, and clearly were, according to overwhelming and independently verifiable evidence, it becomes genuinely difficult to explain why this same tradition of careful, systematic observation would have somehow failed to produce any surviving record of an entire additional planet, one supposedly significant enough to warrant its own extensive mythology, passing through the inner solar system on a regular, predictable cycle. None of this diminishes the genuine mystery and wonder surrounding the actual Anunnaki, the gods these same astronomers ultimately served, and whose calendar these observations were largely designed to maintain. If anything, understanding just how rigorous and mathematically sophisticated Babylonian astronomy genuinely was makes the real, documented Anunnaki timeline feel even more impressive. A civilization capable of both spinning elaborate multi-generational mythology about warring gods and simultaneously tracking the physical movements of celestial bodies with a precision that continues to impress professional astronomers examining these same records today. Still, understanding why Sitchin's theory captured so much public imagination requires looking a little closer at exactly which passages of these ancient texts he leaned on most heavily, and why certain details in the original Sumerian and Akkadian myths made his interpretation feel, to many readers, disturbingly plausible. The specific details that fueled the theory. One of the strongest pieces of evidence Sitchin and his followers point to involves the sheer amount of surviving Sumerian and Akkadian literature that describes the Anunnaki traveling between the heavens and the earth using vehicles and structures that some readers have interpreted as descriptions of flight. Ancient texts describe gods traveling in what translators have rendered as sky chambers or boats of heaven, imagery that ancient astronaut proponents interpret as garbled descriptions of aircraft or spacecraft passed down through oral tradition long after the original meaning had been lost. Mainstream Assyriologists offer a much simpler explanation for this imagery. Sumerian and Babylonian cosmology consistently described the sky itself as a kind of solid dome or vault, with the sun, moon, and stars understood as physical objects moving across or through this structure. Descriptions of gods traveling across the heavens in boats or chariots align naturally with how the Sumerians pictured the physical mechanics of their own cosmos, similar to how many ancient cultures around the world describe the sun as being pulled across the sky by a chariot or a boat, without any of them needing prior knowledge of actual flight technology to imagine such a journey. This comparative point deserves a bit more elaboration, since it applies far beyond Mesopotamia alone. Ancient Egyptian religion describes the sun god Ra traveling across the sky each day in a solar bark, a boat specifically designed for celestial travel, while ancient Greek mythology describes the sun god Helios driving a fiery chariot across the heavens from dawn until dusk. Neither Egyptian nor Greek civilization is typically associated with ancient astronaut theories, in the same way Mesopotamia has become through Sitchin's specific work, which suggests that this particular kind of celestial travel imagery reflects a widely shared, independently developed way that ancient cultures across entirely separate regions conceptualize the physical movement of divine beings and celestial bodies through the sky, rather than evidence of a single shared historical memory involving actual flying vehicles. Another frequently cited detail involves the specific motivation given for humanity's creation, the need for a labor force to dig canals and, according to some interpretations, extract minerals from the earth. Sitchin leaned heavily on this labor narrative, connecting it to reports of ancient gold mining activity in various regions, including sites in Africa that some ancient astronaut proponents claim show evidence of unusually old mining operations. Sitchin argued that the Anunnaki needed vast quantities of gold specifically to repair a damaged atmosphere on their home world, and that this practical, resource-driven motivation was later reinterpreted by ancient scribes simply as service to the gods. Mainstream historians and geologists who have examined these same mining sites generally date them to periods consistent with known human mining technology and known trade routes for gold and copper throughout the ancient Near East and Africa, finding no evidence requiring an explanation involving extraterrestrial visitors. The demand for gold and precious metals throughout ancient Mesopotamian civilization is extremely well documented in ordinary trade records and temple inventories, reflecting its use in jewelry, religious statuary, and royal displays of wealth, rather than any application connected to planetary atmospheric repair. Perhaps the most emotionally compelling piece of evidence cited by ancient astronaut theorists involves a passage from the Book of Genesis referencing a group called the Nephilim, described in the text as the offspring of unions between divine beings, referred to as the sons of God, and human women, producing a race of legendary heroes and giants. Sitchin and later researchers connected this biblical passage directly to the Anunnaki, arguing that it preserved a folk memory of genetic experimentation carried out by these visiting beings on the human population. This particular connection deserves careful, honest treatment, since it touches on a passage that some later religious and cultural retellings have unfortunately used to justify troubling ideas about interbreeding and coercion between these divine or extraterrestrial beings and ordinary human women, ideas that the original ancient texts themselves never actually describe in graphic or exploitative detail. The genuine biblical passage in question is extremely brief and vague, and mainstream biblical scholars have offered several competing interpretations over the centuries, including readings that treat the sons of God as fallen angels, as descendants of a righteous human lineage, or as royal figures claiming divine status, none of which require any connection to Mesopotamian mythology at all, let alone to visitors from another planet. Sitchin's later books extended his core Anunnaki theory well beyond Mesopotamia itself, drawing connections to ancient Egyptian religion, the construction of the pyramids at Giza, and even to archaeological sites in the Americas, arguing that a single, coherent extraterrestrial presence influenced the development of ancient civilizations across entirely separate continents. Mainstream archaeologists and historians studying these various sites independently have generally found that each civilization's monumental architecture and religious tradition can be explained through its own specific historical, engineering, and cultural context, without requiring a single unifying external influence connecting societies that, according to overwhelming archaeological and genetic evidence, had no direct contact with one another during the periods in question. This broader pattern, extending a theory built on contested Mesopotamian translations outward to explain unrelated archaeological mysteries on other continents entirely, is a common feature of ancient astronaut theories more generally, and it's one of the specific structural elements that professional archaeologists point to when explaining why they treat these theories as fundamentally different in kind from ordinary, evidence-based historical revision. With the core claims of Sitchin's theory now laid out honestly alongside the mainstream scholarly response to each one, it's worth turning our attention to how this entire idea managed to spread so widely and so quickly through popular culture, eventually reaching an audience many times larger than academic Assyriology ever could on its own. How an ancient word became a modern phenomenon. Sitchin's Earth Chronicles series continued for decades, eventually spanning 7 main books along with several companion volumes, and his ideas found a receptive audience, partly because they arrived at a moment when public fascination with space exploration, unidentified flying objects, and questions about humanity's origins was already running high throughout the later 20th century. Sitchin positioned his work as a kind of hidden history, one that mainstream academic institutions had either failed to notice or had actively suppressed, a framing that gave his readers the appealing sense of uncovering forbidden knowledge rather than simply reading an alternative interpretation of ancient literature. Sitchin continued writing and defending his theories right up until his death in 2010, remaining a prolific and dedicated author for over 3 decades, despite the substantial and consistent scholarly pushback his work received throughout that entire period. He gave numerous public lectures and interviews defending his translations against academic critics, generally maintaining that his background outside formal Assyriology gave him a fresh perspective unencumbered by what he characterized as institutional bias among professional scholars invested in more conventional interpretations. This willingness to continue engaging publicly with his critics, rather than simply retreating from scrutiny, contributed to his lasting visibility within the broader alternative history community even decades after his initial publications first appeared. This framing, presenting alternative historical claims as suppressed rather than simply unsupported by evidence, has proven remarkably effective across many different subjects far beyond Sitchin's specific work, and understanding why it resonates so strongly with audiences offers a useful lens for evaluating similar claims encountered elsewhere. Framing a theory as forbidden knowledge actively discourages the kind of ordinary scrutiny and fact-checking that most other claims receive, since any scholarly pushback can be reinterpreted by believers as further evidence of the very suppression the theory originally proposed, creating a self-reinforcing loop that makes the theory difficult to dislodge through evidence alone, regardless of how thoroughly that evidence has been documented and published in accessible, peer-reviewed academic literature. This dynamic is worth naming plainly, since it appears again and again across many different fields of alternative or fringe historical claims, not just those involving the Anunnaki specifically. A theory that predicts and preempts its own critics, treating expert disagreement as confirmation rather than refutation, becomes structurally resistant to the ordinary correction process that eventually filters out most incorrect historical claims over time. Recognizing this pattern doesn't require dismissing every unconventional historical claim automatically. It simply means paying close attention to whether a given claim can, in principle, be checked against verifiable primary source evidence by an independent party, and whether the proponents of that claim genuinely welcome that kind of scrutiny, or instead frame any resulting disagreement as proof of a wider conspiracy. This framing proved incredibly durable. Decades after Sitchin's first book was published, a long-running television series dedicated to exploring similar ideas across dozens of ancient civilizations brought these concepts to an even wider mainstream audience, introducing entirely new generations of viewers to the Anunnaki, Nibiru, and the broader ancient astronaut hypothesis, often presenting these ideas alongside genuine, uncontested archaeological sites and artifacts in a way that blurred the line between established history and speculative theory for many casual viewers. The internet age accelerated this spread even further, allowing Sitchin's core claims to circulate widely through articles, videos, and social media discussions, often stripped of the careful caveats and academic pushback that accompanied more rigorous treatments of the same ancient source material. For many people encountering the word Anunnaki for the first time through these channels, the extraterrestrial interpretation arrives already fully formed, often without any awareness that an entirely separate, much older, and much better documented body of scholarship exists describing these same figures as gods within a specific historical religious tradition. It's genuinely worth appreciating both threads of this story on their own terms. The documented historical Anunnaki, the shifting 3,000-year religious concept we traced from An and Enlil through Marduk, and finally to the underworld judges of the dead, represents an extraordinary and well-preserved window into how one of humanity's very first civilizations understood divinity, kingship, and the natural world. The modern reinterpretation, regardless of its scientific merit, represents its own fascinating case study in how ancient texts can be reread, reimagined, and transformed by successive generations to answer entirely new questions about humanity's place in the universe. The scholars who pushed back. Sitchin's theory didn't go unchallenged, and several dedicated scholars devoted considerable time and effort specifically to addressing his claims point by point, a genuinely unusual response given how rarely professional academics engage this directly with popular alternative history writers, most of whom are simply ignored by mainstream scholarship rather than actively rebutted. One of the most thorough and widely cited critiques came from a scholar named Michael Heiser, who held a doctorate in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages and devoted substantial portions of his academic career specifically to examining Sitchin's translations line by line, comparing them directly against the original Sumerian and Akkadian texts alongside standard academic dictionaries and grammatical references used by professional Assyriologists. Heiser's published critiques identified consistent, specific patterns of mistranslation throughout Sitchin's work, arguing that many of Sitchin's most dramatic claims rested on words and phrases that simply do not mean what Sitchin claimed they meant when checked against the broader body of surviving Sumerian and Akkadian literature. Heiser made his complete body of critique freely available through his own website and public writing, specifically so that interested readers without access to expensive academic journals could examine his line-by-line comparisons for themselves, checking his cited dictionary entries and grammatical references directly rather than simply taking his conclusions on faith. This transparent, publicly accessible approach to what might otherwise have remained a fairly obscure academic dispute meant that Heiser's critiques reached a considerably wider general audience than most scholarly rebuttals of popular alternative history claims typically manage to achieve, allowing genuinely curious readers on either side of the debate to engage directly with the specific linguistic evidence rather than simply choosing a side based on which author they found more personally persuasive or trustworthy. Heiser's approach was notable for engaging with Sitchin's specific claims on Sitchin's own terms, working directly from the same primary source tablets rather than dismissing the theory outright without addressing its details, a method that gave his critique particular credibility among readers genuinely curious about the underlying evidence rather than simply looking for confirmation of an existing position on either side of the debate. Other Assyriologists and biblical scholars have echoed similar concerns in their own published work, generally converging on the conclusion that Sitchin's translations reflect a fundamental unfamiliarity with the grammatical structure and established vocabulary of Sumerian and Akkadian, rather than representing a genuinely alternative but equally valid scholarly interpretation of the same evidence. This kind of direct, detailed scholarly engagement with a popular alternative theory is genuinely valuable regardless of which side of the debate a person ultimately finds more persuasive, since it ensures that the underlying claims can actually be checked against the primary source material by anyone willing to do the work, rather than remaining a matter of pure assertion on either side. Having covered both the ancient religious history and the modern reinterpretation, along with the scholarly response to that reinterpretation, it's worth returning now to the original texts themselves, because there's an entire cast of individual Anunnaki gods and goddesses whose stories remain fascinating regardless of which interpretation a person finds more compelling. And one figure among them stands out as perhaps the most consequential of all when it comes to how kingship itself was understood across the ancient Near East. The Anunnaki and the origins of kingship. According to a document known as the Sumerian King List, an ancient record attempting to trace the lineage of rulers from the very dawn of civilization, kingship itself was said to have descended directly from heaven, granted to humanity by the Anunnaki as a gift meant to bring order to a chaotic world. The list describes a series of legendary rulers governing before the Great Flood we discussed earlier, with reign lengths measured in tens of thousands of years, figures who blur the line between historical memory and pure myth in a way that has fascinated historians for well over a century. The specific reign lengths recorded for these antediluvian kings are genuinely staggering by any modern standard, with individual rulers credited with reigns lasting tens of thousands of years each, and the combined total reign length attributed to this entire pre-flood dynasty stretching across a span of time that vastly exceeds even the most generous archaeological estimates for how long organized human settlement has actually existed in the region. Scholars have proposed several competing explanations for these extraordinary numbers, ranging from the possibility that ancient scribes used a different non-decimal counting system that was later misunderstood by copyists, to the suggestion that these figures were never intended to be read as literal chronological history at all, functioning instead as a symbolic statement about the immense antiquity and divine legitimacy of kingship itself, regardless of whether any individual king or exact reign length corresponded to genuine historical fact. After the flood, according to this same tradition, kingship descended from heaven a second time, landing first in the city of Kish before eventually passing to other cities across the region as political power shifted over the centuries. Every legitimate Sumerian ruler, according to this framework, needed to trace their authority back through this unbroken chain, ultimately tracing back to the will of the Anunnaki themselves, and specifically to the blessing of An and Enlil. The post-flood portion of the king list becomes noticeably more historically grounded as it progresses, with reign lengths gradually shrinking to figures that align much more plausibly with genuine human lifespans, and several rulers named in the later sections of the list can be cross-referenced against independent archaeological evidence, including inscriptions, seals, and building dedications bearing their names discovered at actual excavated sites. This gradual transition from clearly mythical reign lengths to historically verifiable rulers offers scholars a genuinely useful window into exactly where, along this ancient timeline, the Sumerians themselves seem to have understood the line between legendary prehistory and documented, remembered history, even if that line was never explicitly drawn or acknowledged within the text of the king list itself. Multiple versions of the Sumerian king list have survived, copied by different scribes in different cities across several centuries, and comparing these versions against one another reveals interesting variations in exactly which cities and which rulers are included, reflecting the political rivalries and shifting allegiances of the specific scribes and cities responsible for each particular copy. A version compiled under the patronage of one city's ruling dynasty might emphasize that city's own historical primacy, while a version compiled elsewhere might present a subtly different sequence of dominant cities, offering historians a genuinely useful tool for understanding not just the raw chronological data the list claims to record, but also the specific political and religious agendas of the scribes and patrons responsible for each individual surviving copy. This connection between the Anunnaki and legitimate kingship reaches perhaps its most famous expression in the story of Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, whose adventures were recorded in one of the oldest and most celebrated works of literature in human history. According to the Epic of Gilgamesh, this particular king was described as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a genuinely unusual proportion that reflects just how directly Mesopotamian kings claimed descent from and connection to the Anunnaki themselves. Throughout his adventures, Gilgamesh interacts directly with several members of the Anunnaki, including receiving aid from the sun god Utu during his quest to defeat the monstrous guardian Humbaba, and facing the wrath of the goddess Inanna after he rejected her romantic advances, an episode that led to the deployment of a monstrous bull sent to punish him for the insult. Gilgamesh's story also includes his own encounter with the flood hero Utnapishtim, the Babylonian name for Ziusudra, who recounts the entire flood narrative directly to Gilgamesh, in a conversation that represents one of the most direct surviving links between the Anunnaki's ancient mythology and the personal, individual quest of a single-named human ruler. Gilgamesh's ultimate quest throughout the epic is a search for immortality, spurred by grief over the death of his close companion Enkidu, and his failure to achieve that immortality despite his partial divine heritage carries a genuinely poignant message that recurs throughout Mesopotamian literature. That even the most powerful humans, no matter how closely connected to the Anunnaki through blood or favor, remained fundamentally mortal, subject to the same laws of death that governed every other person who had ever lived. Enkidu's own death, which sets this entire final portion of the epic into motion, is itself decreed directly by the assembly of the Anunnaki as punishment following the joint killing of both Humbaba and a monstrous bull sent by Inanna, with the divine council determining that one of the two companions must die for these actions, and ultimately selecting Enkidu rather than Gilgamesh himself. Enkidu's lingering, agonizing decline, described across multiple tablets in genuinely affecting detail as he curses the very circumstances that brought him into companionship with Gilgamesh before eventually reconciling with his fate, represents one of the most emotionally direct portrayals of grief and mortality anywhere in ancient literature. And it's this raw, personal loss, rather than any abstract theological concern that ultimately drives Gilgamesh toward his desperate search for a way to escape death entirely. This tension between divine favor and mortal limitation defines much of how ordinary Sumerians and Babylonians understood their own relationship with the Anunnaki more broadly. Kings could claim extraordinary closeness to these divine beings, receiving their blessing and their legitimacy, but that closeness never translated into actual immunity from death, disease, or the eventual judgment that awaited every soul in Ereshkigal's underworld. With kingship and mortality now firmly established as central themes running through the entire Anunnaki timeline, it's time to look more closely at exactly how many individual gods made up this divine council, and what specific roles and responsibilities separated one Anunnaki deity from another within this sprawling, multi-generational family of gods. Enki's gifts and the foundations of civilization. Before turning to the full family tree of the Anunnaki, it's worth pausing on one additional story involving Enki that reveals just how directly this pantheon was credited with organizing the entire structure of human civilization itself, not merely creating humanity as a labor force, but actively designing the institutions and skills that would allow that labor force to build a functioning society. According to Sumerian tradition, Enki traveled across the earth, distributing what the texts call the me, a term without any clean English equivalent that essentially referred to the fundamental building blocks of organized civilization. These included concepts as grand as kingship and priesthood, alongside remarkably specific and mundane elements like the crafts of carpentry and metalworking, the invention of musical instruments, the establishment of courts to resolve disputes, and even more unusual entries describing abstract concepts like straightforward speech, deceit, and conflict itself. According to the myth, Enki alone determined which cities and which gods within the Anunnaki hierarchy would receive which specific gifts, effectively designing the entire framework of civilized life from the ground up and distributing its components according to his own judgment. The surviving catalogue of these me numbers, well over 100 distinct entries across the various tablets that reference this myth, and modern translators continue to debate the precise meaning of many individual terms, since numerous entries describe abstract social and religious concepts that don't map neatly onto any single English word. What remains clear across every scholarly attempt at translation, however, is the sheer comprehensiveness of the underlying ambition, a genuine attempt to catalogue literally everything that made organized civilization possible, from the highest ideals of justice and kingship down to the humblest details of daily craftsmanship, treating all of it as equally sacred and equally worth attributing to divine origin within the broader Anunnaki tradition. This role as architect of civilization set up one of the more entertaining myths to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, involving Enki, the goddess Inanna, and a considerable amount of beer. According to the story, Inanna traveled to Enki's city of Eridu, specifically hoping to acquire some of these sacred me for her own city of Uruk. Enki welcomed her as an honored guest, and the two began drinking together, toast after toast, until Enki, increasingly intoxicated, began generously gifting Inanna the me themselves, apparently losing track of just how much he was giving away. Inanna, accepting each gift eagerly, loaded them onto her boat and departed for Uruk before her host could sober up and reconsider. When Enki woke and realized what he had done, he dispatched a series of monstrous servants to chase down Inanna's boat and reclaim the stolen gifts before she could reach her city. What follows is an extended and genuinely entertaining chase sequence as wave after wave of Enki's servants intercept Inanna's boat at various named docks along the river, only to be repelled each time by her clever attendant Ninshubur. By the story's conclusion, Inanna successfully delivers the me to Uruk, and Enki, rather than continuing to pursue the matter further, accepts the loss with what the surviving tablets describe as grudging admiration, effectively conceding that Uruk had earned its new status as a center of civilization through Inanna's own cleverness and persistence. Each wave of pursuit in this chase sequence follows a strikingly similar pattern, and this repetition appears to have been an intentional storytelling device rather than simple redundancy, building tension through escalation across each successive confrontation. Enki dispatches a new set of monstrous creatures. They catch up with Inanna's boat at a specific named dock along the river, and Ninshubur, acting entirely on Inanna's behalf, negotiates or fends off each threat in turn, allowing the vessel to continue onward toward Uruk. By the time the final pursuit is repelled, the sheer number of named locations and repeated confrontations gives the entire episode an almost rhythmic, chant-like quality, precisely the kind of structure that would have made it especially memorable and enjoyable to recite aloud during festivals or public performances. A reminder that these myths were composed first and foremost to be spoken and heard by a live audience, not silently read from a page the way modern readers typically encounter them today. This story illustrates something important about how the Anunnaki as a whole were understood by the civilizations who worshipped them. They weren't simply distant, abstract forces governing weather and fate from an inaccessible heaven. They were active participants in an ongoing, sometimes messy, sometimes genuinely comedic process of building and organizing human civilization, capable of drunken generosity, wounded pride, and eventual gracious acceptance of defeat, qualities that made them feel accessible and relatable to the ordinary Sumerian farmers and craftsmen who prayed to them daily for success in their own, much smaller, much more mundane endeavors. With Enki's role in organizing civilization now established, it's time to return to the broader family structure of the Anunnaki as a whole, tracing the specific relationships and responsibilities that connected each major deity to the others within this vast divine hierarchy. The family tree of the Anunnaki. Among the most prominent members of the Anunnaki was Inanna, later known as Ishtar in Akkadian and Babylonian tradition, a goddess whose domain covered love, fertility, and war simultaneously, a combination that made her one of the most complex and unpredictable figures in the entire pantheon. We've already touched on her failed romantic pursuit of Gilgamesh, but her most famous myth involves a personal descent into the underworld itself, where she attempted to claim dominion over her sister Ereshkigal's realm and was struck down by the very council of Anunnaki judges we discussed earlier. Inanna's ambition, unlike the more destructive impulses that drove Enlil's decision to flood the earth, is never framed within the surviving texts as inherently wrong or excessive in itself. Hymns celebrating her achievements list city after city, temple after temple, where her worship flourished across the Mesopotamian world, describing her rise to prominence with evident pride and admiration rather than caution or moral disapproval. This makes her eventual decision to descend into the underworld feel less like villainous overreach and more like the natural, almost inevitable next step for a goddess who had already claimed dominance over nearly every other domain a deity within the Anunnaki could hold, leaving the underworld as the one remaining territory still entirely outside her control. Inanna's temple stood in Uruk, the same city we've already discussed in connection with An, and her worship there was so significant that Uruk's cultural and religious prominence throughout much of early Sumerian history is directly tied to her patronage. Surviving hymns praising Inanna describe her in genuinely striking, larger-than-life terms, celebrating her power to bring both weeping and laughter, to level mountains in anger and inspire the tenderest devotion in the same breath, language that reflects just how vast and untamable her particular domain within the Anunnaki was understood to be by the people who worshipped her. According to that myth, Inanna passed through 7 separate gates on her way into the underworld, stripped of a piece of her royal clothing and jewelry at each threshold, until she arrived before her sister, completely naked and powerless. The Anunnaki judges fixed her with the look of death, and her body was left hanging on a hook for 3 days before her loyal servant successfully petitioned Enki for help, ultimately leading to her resurrection, though not without a heavy price. Someone had to take her place in the underworld, a fate that eventually fell to her own husband, a shepherd king named Dumuzi, who was forced to spend half of every year among the dead as a direct consequence. The specific items stripped from Inanna at each of the 7 gates are listed with careful, ritualistic precision across the surviving tablets. First her crown, then her earrings, then the beads around her neck, then the ornaments covering her chest, then a golden ring from her hand, then a measuring rod and cord she carried as symbols of justice and order, and finally, at the 7th and last gate, her royal robe itself. Each gatekeeper, when questioned about why she must surrender these items, offered the same terse response, that this was simply the ancient, unquestionable custom of the underworld, building a genuine sense of mounting dread as the goddess loses more and more of her identity and status with each threshold she crosses, until she arrives before the Anunnaki judges with absolutely nothing left to signify her former power. Dumuzi's ultimate fate, once Inanna returned from the underworld and discovered him seated comfortably on her own throne rather than mourning her apparent death, involved a desperate chase in which he attempted to escape the demons sent to drag him down in her place, transforming himself with the aid of the sun god Utu into various forms, including a snake and a gazelle. Despite these efforts, he was eventually captured, and only through the intervention of his devoted sister, Geshtinana, who willingly offered to take his place for half of each year, did the 2 siblings ultimately arrive at the alternating arrangement that came to explain the changing of the seasons within Mesopotamian religious tradition. Dumuzi's descent coinciding with the dry, barren summer months, and his return coinciding with the fertile growing season each year. Ereshkigal herself deserves particular attention as another central figure among the Anunnaki, since her rule over the underworld represents one of the more emotionally complex stories in this entire mythology. Unlike her sister, who could travel freely between the heavens and the earth, Ereshkigal was permanently confined to her dark realm, ruling in genuine isolation until a war god named Nergal was sent to answer for a diplomatic insult against her. Their initial confrontation turned into an unexpected romance, and Nergal eventually returned to the underworld permanently, becoming Ereshkigal's husband and co-ruler, finally ending her centuries of solitary rule. Nergal's own background as a war and plague deity connects him to another prominent member of the Anunnaki we haven't yet fully introduced, a god named Ninurta, son of Enlil, celebrated across Sumerian tradition as a warrior who defended the natural and cosmic order against monstrous threats. Ninurta's most famous myth describes his battle against a demon called Arsag, whose rise to power caused stones and rocks across the earth to rise up in open rebellion, forming an army capable of disrupting rivers and rendering fields infertile. Armed with a talking mace named Sharur, said to possess its own voice and capable of offering strategic counsel during the campaign, Ninurta ultimately defeated Arsag and, in a surprisingly administrative turn for a war myth, proceeded to assign specific values and purposes to each type of stone defeated in the conflict, establishing the entire hierarchy of value for minerals that Sumerian civilization would use going forward. Sharur's role in this myth extends well beyond simple weaponry, since the text describes the mace actively scouting ahead of Ninurta across vast distances to assess the scale of Arsag's rebellion, returning to offer detailed strategic counsel, and at certain points even expressing genuine doubt about whether Ninurta could actually prevail against such an overwhelming force. This dynamic between a god and his own sentient weapon, one capable of independent judgment, doubt, and counsel, represents one of the more unusual relationships found anywhere within Anunnaki mythology, giving this particular myth a genuinely distinctive, almost buddy narrative quality that sets it apart from the more straightforwardly heroic battle myths found elsewhere across this same broader tradition. Ninurta also appears in a separate myth involving a monstrous bird named Anzu, who stole the Tablet of Destinies directly from Enlil while the senior god bathed, an object believed to grant its holder ultimate authority over fate itself. With several other senior gods declining the dangerous task of confronting Anzu directly, Ninurta accepted the challenge, engaging the thief in an aerial battle fought high above the earth and successfully recovering the stolen tablet, further cementing his reputation within the Anunnaki as the deity willing to personally confront threats that even his more senior relatives found too intimidating to face themselves. The underworld itself, ruled by Ereshkigal and populated by these Anunnaki judges, was described across Mesopotamian texts in genuinely bleak, unforgiving terms. A realm of dust and silence where the dead subsisted on clay and drank from puddles, existing rather than truly living. Unlike later religious traditions that would divide the afterlife into distinct realms of reward and punishment, the Mesopotamian underworld offered essentially the same diminished, joyless existence to everyone who entered it, regardless of how virtuous or wicked they had been during their mortal life. A detail that makes the entire concept of the Anunnaki as underworld judges feel less concerned with punishing wrongdoing specifically and more concerned with simply enforcing the fixed, unbreakable boundary between the living and the dead. Another major figure among the Anunnaki was Nana, sometimes called Sin in later Akkadian tradition, the god of the moon and the son of Enlil, born under unusual circumstances following his father's banishment to the underworld as punishment for a serious transgression against the goddess Ninlil. Nana's primary worship center stood in the city of Ur, where an enormous ziggurat was constructed in his honor, a structure whose ruins remain partially standing in modern Iraq today, offering physical, tangible evidence of just how seriously his worship was taken across the ancient world. The circumstances of Nana's conception deserve a fuller telling, since they represent a rare instance within Anunnaki mythology of a senior god facing genuine consequences for wrongdoing. According to the surviving text, a young Enlil became infatuated with Ninlil after observing her bathing in a canal, and despite her explicit refusal, he pursued the encounter regardless. The assembly of the Anunnaki, rather than overlooking this transgression given Enlil's senior status within the pantheon, judged his conduct serious enough to warrant genuine punishment, banishing him to the underworld. Ninlil, pregnant with Nana, chose to follow Enlil down into the underworld rather than remain separated from the child she now carried, and the resulting myth becomes a strange, layered narrative about consequence and choice, ultimately resolving through Enlil fathering 3 additional children under various disguises to serve as substitutes, allowing the original child, who would become the moon god, to ascend safely to the heavens instead. This willingness among Sumerian scribes to preserve a story depicting one of their most powerful gods facing formal judgment and consequence for wrongdoing reflects a genuinely striking level of moral seriousness within Anunnaki religious tradition, one that resisted simply glossing over the misconduct of even its most senior members. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, built primarily under a king named Ur-Nammu and later expanded by his son Shulgi roughly 4,000 years ago, remains one of the best preserved examples of Mesopotamian religious architecture anywhere in the region, its stepped terraces designed specifically to bring Nana's earthly dwelling closer to the heavens he governed as god of the moon. Nana's own mythology tends toward calm stability rather than dramatic conflict compared to some of the other Anunnaki we've discussed tonight, reflecting his role governing the steady, predictable cycles of the lunar calendar that Sumerian civilization depended upon for tracking months and religious festivals throughout the year. Rounding out this core family was Ninhursag, sometimes called the Mother Goddess, credited across multiple surviving myths with a direct role in the creation of both gods and humans. Her most detailed myth involves a complicated dispute with Enki over the consumption of sacred plants, resulting in a curse that nearly killed him before Ninhursag relented and performed an elaborate healing ritual, creating several minor healing deities in the process, each one assigned to cure a specific ailing part of Enki's body. That particular myth begins in a location called Dilmun, described across the surviving texts as a genuinely paradise-like realm where no sickness existed, no old age brought suffering, and even predatory animals lived without violence, a portrait of complete harmony that stands as one of the earliest surviving descriptions of a paradise garden in world literature, predating similar concepts in later Mesopotamian and biblical tradition by a significant margin. Many historians identify Dilmun with the actual island of Bahrain and the surrounding Persian Gulf region, a place the Sumerians traded with extensively for goods like copper and pearls, making it a striking thought that one of humanity's earliest recorded paradises may correspond to an actual, physical trading partner rather than a purely imaginary realm invented for the purposes of religious storytelling. This particular myth carries a linguistic detail that has fascinated biblical scholars for well over a century, since one of the healing deities Ninhursag created, specifically to cure Enki's ailing rib, was given a name that can be translated as both Lady of the Rib and Lady who gives life, a pun made possible by the specific structure of the Sumerian language. Given the striking resonance between this detail and the biblical account of Eve being formed from Adam's rib, though with the gender roles notably reversed, some scholars have proposed that this Sumerian myth represents one of the deepest and oldest roots of an idea that would echo forward through religious tradition for thousands of years afterward, eventually surfacing again in one of the most widely known creation narratives in the Western world. This kind of wordplay, where a single Sumerian term carries two entirely distinct meanings depending on context, appears throughout Mesopotamian literature more broadly, and scholars studying these texts have to remain constantly alert to the possibility that a given passage is doing double duty, conveying both a literal narrative meaning and a secondary symbolic layer accessible only to an audience already fluent in the specific linguistic ambiguity being exploited. This particular pun, involving the rib and the concept of life, represents one of the more elegant examples of this technique surviving from the entire Anunnaki tradition, and it's precisely this kind of subtle, layered wordplay that continues to reward careful, patient scholarly attention centuries after the language itself stopped being spoken by anyone at all. The relationship between Inanna and Dumuzi, referenced earlier in connection with her descent into the underworld, deserves a bit more context here as well, since their courtship represented one of the most significant recurring religious ceremonies performed by Sumerian kings throughout the entire Anunnaki timeline. Each year, a ritual known as the sacred marriage was performed, in which the reigning king symbolically took on the role of Dumuzi, uniting ceremonially with a priestess representing Inanna, a ceremony believed to guarantee fertility and agricultural abundance for the coming year across the entire kingdom. This practice, documented across multiple Sumerian cities and continuing in various forms into the Babylonian period, represented one of the most direct and literal ways in which Mesopotamian kingship attempted to bind itself to the favor of the Anunnaki, treating the fertility of the land as something requiring active annual renewal through ritual participation, rather than something that could simply be assumed to continue automatically from one year to the next. Together, these figures, An, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Ereshkigal, Nergal, Nana, and Ninhursag, along with dozens of lesser deities associated with agriculture, writing, healing, and craftsmanship, formed the vast interconnected family that Mesopotamian civilization understood collectively as the Anunnaki. Their relationships, rivalries, and reconciliations provided the framework through which the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians explained virtually every aspect of the natural and social world around them. The goddess who made this entire timeline possible. Before moving into the final chapters of the Anunnaki's ancient history, it's worth acknowledging one additional member of this divine family whose contribution made literally everything covered so far in this video possible to know about in the first place: a goddess named Nisaba, patron of writing, grain, and scribal knowledge. Nisaba's association with grain came first historically, reflecting her origins as a harvest goddess tied to the fertility of Sumerian farmland, and early depictions show her crowned with stalks of barley. But as Sumerian civilization developed increasingly complex systems for tracking harvests, temple offerings, and trade, the practical need for record-keeping gave rise to cuneiform script itself, and Nisaba became closely associated with this new technology as the divine patron of the professional scribes responsible for maintaining these written records. This connection between grain and writing reflects the actual historical sequence of how written language came into being in the first place. The very earliest cuneiform tablets ever discovered aren't works of literature or religious hymns at all. They're administrative records tracking grain harvests, livestock counts, and temple distributions, meaning that Nisaba's evolution from a simple harvest goddess into the patron of scribal knowledge mirrors, quite directly, the actual practical need that gave birth to writing as a technology in ancient Sumer. It's genuinely remarkable, considering everything covered throughout this video so far, that every single myth, every flood narrative, every account of Marduk's battle with Tiamat, every list of Anunnaki judges presiding over the underworld survives today only because generations of scribes trained under Nisaba's patronage painstakingly pressed reed styluses into wet clay, tablet after tablet, preserving these stories across a span of literally thousands of years. Without that specific tradition of careful, methodical record-keeping, the entire timeline we've traced tonight, from An's earliest temple hymns through Marduk's rise to Ashurbanipal's buried library, would have vanished entirely, leaving modern researchers with nothing but vague second-hand references filtered through Greek historians, centuries removed from the actual civilization itself. With Nisaba's essential contribution to this timeline properly acknowledged, we return now to the final centuries of organized Anunnaki worship, a period when the concept of divine kingship reached new and increasingly militaristic extremes under the growing power of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire and the final centuries of Anunnaki worship. As the Assyrian Empire rose to dominance across Mesopotamia in the centuries following Babylon's peak, the worship of the Anunnaki continued, though it increasingly served the political ambitions of Assyrian kings in ways that grew more overtly militaristic than in earlier periods. Assyrian rulers frequently invoked the Anunnaki alongside their own patron god Ashur to justify campaigns of conquest, describing their military victories as directly sanctioned and even actively assisted by the divine assembly. This militarization of Anunnaki worship reflects the broader character of Assyrian civilization itself, which built one of the most formidable and often brutally effective military machines of the entire ancient world, expanding its borders across a vast territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to Egypt at its height. Assyrian kings commissioned massive stone reliefs depicting their military campaigns in extraordinarily graphic detail, and accompanying inscriptions consistently frame these conquests not as acts of simple political ambition, but as the fulfillment of a divine mandate handed down directly from the Anunnaki, a rhetorical strategy that both justified the violence of conquest and reinforce the king's own legitimacy as the chosen instrument of divine will. Assyrian royal annals, a genre of inscription recording each king's military campaigns year by year throughout his reign, consistently open each new campaign season with a formal invocation of divine sanction, crediting specific members of the Anunnaki with providing both the strategic wisdom and the raw martial power necessary for victory. These annals were carefully preserved and copied across successive generations of scribes, creating a continuous documentary record of Assyrian military history that historians today can cross-reference against archaeological evidence from conquered territories, generally finding a striking degree of consistency between the boastful claims recorded in these religiously framed inscriptions and the actual physical evidence of destruction and conquest uncovered at affected sites throughout the wider region. Royal inscriptions from this period, carved onto massive stone monuments and palace walls, describe Assyrian kings receiving weapons, strategic guidance, and outright battlefield assistance from various members of the Anunnaki, particularly war-associated deities like Nergal and Ninurta, whose martial mythology we touched on earlier tonight. These inscriptions weren't simply religious flourishes. They served a genuine propaganda function, reinforcing the idea that Assyrian expansion represented the literal will of the gods rather than simple human ambition, a framing that would have been immediately recognizable and persuasive to a population raised on centuries of stories about kingship descending directly from heaven. The Great Library of Ashurbanipal, the same collection of tablets that would later provide George Smith with the flood narrative in the 19th century, represents the final, most comprehensive attempt by any ancient Mesopotamian civilization to systematically collect and preserve the entire religious and literary tradition surrounding the Anunnaki. Ashurbanipal's scribes gathered copies of the Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis epic, and hundreds of other texts from across the region, organizing what amounted to the largest library in the ancient world up to that point, a deliberate effort to preserve this entire body of knowledge for future generations. Ashurbanipal himself was reportedly unusual among Assyrian kings for his personal literacy and genuine scholarly interest in these ancient texts, a trait he specifically boasted about in his own royal inscriptions, describing his ability to read the difficult, archaic Sumerian script that many scribes of his own era could no longer easily decipher without specialized training. This personal investment in preserving and understanding ancient religious literature likely explains why his particular library survived in such remarkably comprehensive form compared to other collections from the same general period, since Ashurbanipal appears to have actively directed his scribes to seek out and copy specific texts from temple archives across the empire, specifically for inclusion in his own royal collection. Surviving colophons, brief scribal notes appended to the end of individual tablets, identifying who copied them and for what purpose, frequently identify texts within Ashurbanipal's library as having been specifically collected or copied on his direct orders, sometimes noting that a particular tablet was sourced from a specific temple archive in a distant city and brought back to Nineveh for careful duplication. This deliberate, centralized collection effort represents one of the earliest documented examples of a ruler treating the preservation of ancient literary and religious tradition as a genuine priority of state, comparable in ambition, if not in scale, to later great libraries of the ancient world. And it's precisely this centralized, deliberate preservation effort that ensured so many of the specific myths covered throughout tonight's video survived in complete or nearly complete form, rather than existing only as scattered, incomplete fragments across dozens of separate, poorly preserved local archives. That effort succeeded in ways Ashurbanipal himself could never have anticipated. When the Assyrian Empire collapsed in 612 BCE, following a coalition assault that destroyed the capital city of Nineveh, the library itself was buried beneath the ruins rather than lost entirely, its clay tablets baked hard and preserved by the very fires that destroyed the city above them. It would remain hidden beneath the earth for well over 2,000 years, waiting silently until 19th century archaeologists finally uncovered it and brought the entire Anunnaki timeline back into the light of human knowledge. With the fall of Nineveh, organized state-sponsored worship of the Anunnaki as a formal religious institution effectively came to an end, though folk traditions and regional beliefs likely persisted in fragmented form for generations afterward, gradually fading as new religious movements, including Zoroastrianism and eventually Christianity and Islam, spread across the region and replaced the ancient Mesopotamian pantheon entirely. The legal legacy the Anunnaki left behind. Before tracing the specific textual echoes of the Anunnaki forward into the Bible, it's worth pausing on one additional legacy of this ancient pantheon that continues to shape legal thought even today, largely without most people realizing its origin. Centuries before Marduk's rise in Babylon, and building directly on legal traditions established under the Anunnaki's earlier authority, Sumerian rulers had already begun issuing formal, written law codes explicitly sanctioned by the gods. The earliest known example, issued by a king named Ur-Nammu of Ur, roughly 2 centuries before the more famous Code of Hammurabi, addressed matters ranging from property disputes to physical injury to marriage and divorce, prescribing specific monetary compensations for various offences rather than relying purely on physical retribution. The preamble to this code explicitly credits divine sanction for the king's authority to establish and enforce these laws, tracing that authority back through Enlil to An himself, the same foundational chain of legitimacy we discussed earlier regarding Sumerian kingship more broadly. This tradition reached its most famous expression centuries later under Hammurabi, the Babylonian king whose law code remains one of the best preserved and most extensively studied legal documents from the ancient world. The stele on which this code was carved shows Hammurabi receiving the laws directly from Shamash, the Babylonian name for the sun god Utu, reinforcing the idea that earthly law derived its ultimate legitimacy from this specific member of the Anunnaki's cosmic authority to witness wrongdoing and judge right from wrong. Hammurabi's code addressed an extraordinarily wide range of daily concerns, from agricultural disputes and construction liability to family law and criminal punishment, prescribing specific consequences for specific violations with a level of legal detail that genuinely impresses modern legal historians studying the document today. The underlying principle connecting all of these Mesopotamian law codes back to the Anunnaki is worth stating plainly. Legitimate human law, according to this entire civilization's worldview, was never simply a human invention subject to arbitrary revision by whichever ruler happened to hold power at a given moment. It derived its authority from the same divine assembly that had granted kingship itself, meaning that a king who violated or ignored this legal tradition risked not just political instability, but genuine divine consequence. A framework that gave Mesopotamian law codes a stability and continuity across ruling dynasties that purely secular legal systems often struggled to maintain. Yet even as formal worship faded, the influence of these ancient stories never fully disappeared, echoing forward through the Hebrew Bible's flood narrative, its references to giants and divine offspring, and its account of a great tower built in defiance of the heavens. Understanding just how directly these later, more familiar religious traditions borrowed from the Anunnaki timeline requires taking a closer look at the specific textual parallels that scholars have identified between Mesopotamian mythology and the religious texts that would eventually dominate the Western world. The direct links between the Anunnaki and the Bible. The most thoroughly documented connection between the Anunnaki timeline and later religious tradition remains the flood narrative, and the parallels here go well beyond a shared basic premise of divine judgment through catastrophic water. Both the Mesopotamian and biblical accounts describe a righteous individual specifically warned in advance. Detailed instructions for building a massive boat, precise measurements included in both versions, the eventual release of birds to test whether the floodwaters had receded, and the boat finally settling on a mountain once the waters withdrew. The sheer specificity of these shared details makes coincidental, independent invention extremely unlikely according to the overwhelming majority of biblical scholars, who generally accept that the Genesis flood account draws directly, whether through oral tradition or later written transmission, from this much older Mesopotamian source material. The specific mechanism by which this transmission likely occurred has been debated extensively among biblical scholars and Assyriologists alike, with many pointing toward the period of Babylonian exile, when a significant portion of the population of the ancient kingdom of Judah was forcibly relocated to Babylon following its conquest in the 6th century before the Common Era. This period of direct, sustained cultural contact between Hebrew scribes and the Babylonian religious and literary tradition, including first-hand exposure to recitations of the Enuma Elish and other Anunnaki-related texts during Babylon's ongoing religious festivals, provides a plausible and well-documented historical pathway through which these ancient Mesopotamian narratives could have directly influenced the final written form of the Hebrew Bible's own creation and flood accounts. This exile period, lasting roughly half a century according to the biblical account before a subsequent Persian ruler permitted the exiled population to return to their homeland, represents one of the most thoroughly documented instances of direct cultural exchange between the descendants of the Anunnaki's original worshippers and the authors responsible for compiling and finalizing what would eventually become the Hebrew Bible. Scholars specializing in this period note that the final editing and compilation of several biblical books likely occurred either during or shortly after this exile, a timeline that aligns closely with when Hebrew scribes would have had their most extensive and sustained direct exposure to Babylonian religious literature and ritual practice, including the specific recitation of the Enuma Elish during the annual Akitu festival we discussed earlier in connection with Marduk's rise to power. Beyond the flood, the biblical story of the Tower of Babel bears a striking resemblance to the historical ziggurat Etemenanki, built in Babylon as part of Marduk's temple complex following his rise to supreme authority among the Anunnaki. Ancient Babylon was renowned throughout the region for its impressive, multi-tiered religious architecture, and the biblical account of a tower built in an attempt to reach the heavens, followed by a divine intervention that confused human language and scattered the builders across the earth, likely reflects genuine historical memory of these massive ziggurats combined with a theological lesson about human pride and ambition. The biblical concept of the Nephilim, briefly mentioned in the book of Genesis as offspring resulting from unions between divine beings and human women, has also been connected by various scholars to broader Mesopotamian traditions describing partly divine figures like Gilgamesh, though the actual textual evidence connecting this specific biblical passage directly to the Anunnaki remains considerably thinner and more speculative than the flood and tower parallels. It's worth being careful and precise here rather than overstating the connection. Mainstream biblical scholarship treats the Nephilim passage as genuinely ambiguous and difficult to interpret even within its own biblical context, and any direct line connecting it specifically to named Mesopotamian deities remains a matter of scholarly debate rather than settled historical consensus. Beyond these narrative parallels, certain administrative and legal concepts found in the Bible, including specific legal principles and even some phrasing found in books like Exodus, show clear structural similarities to earlier Mesopotamian law codes, including the famous Code of Hammurabi, which itself claims divine sanction from the sun god Shamash, the Babylonian name for Utu, one of the Anunnaki we discussed earlier tonight in relation to Gilgamesh's adventures. The specific legal principle of proportional retribution, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, appears in strikingly similar form across both the Hammurabi Code and later biblical legal texts, and scholars generally treat this correspondence as further evidence of the deep and lasting influence Mesopotamian legal and religious tradition exerted on the broader intellectual culture of the ancient Near East, well beyond the borders of Mesopotamia itself. These connections, taken together, suggest something genuinely remarkable about the reach and influence of the Anunnaki timeline. Long after the last Mesopotamian temple fell silent, long after the last priest capable of reading cuneiform script passed away, the stories and legal frameworks first developed to explain and organize the world under this ancient pantheon continued to shape religious and legal thought across an entire region, eventually reaching billions of people through texts most of them have never once associated with ancient Sumer or Babylon at all. Having traced this influence forward into some of the most widely read religious texts in human history, it's worth turning our attention to how the actual physical evidence of the Anunnaki's worship, the temples, the tablets, and the cities themselves continues to be studied and reinterpreted by researchers today, including some ongoing archaeological work that has added genuinely new details to this timeline within just the past few decades. What modern archaeology continues to uncover. Excavation across the region once occupied by Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria has continued steadily since those first 19th century discoveries, though political instability across modern Iraq has periodically interrupted this work, sometimes with devastating consequences for the sites themselves. Looting and deliberate destruction of archaeological sites during periods of conflict have unfortunately resulted in the loss of countless artifacts and tablets that might otherwise have added further detail to our understanding of the Anunnaki timeline, a genuinely tragic gap in the historical record that scholars continue to work around as best they can. The scale of this loss deserves honest acknowledgement. During periods of conflict and instability across Iraq in recent decades, museums and archaeological storage facilities holding thousands of years of accumulated Mesopotamian artifacts have been looted, sometimes systematically, with objects disappearing into international black markets for antiquities where they become extremely difficult to trace or recover. International archaeological organizations and museums have since worked extensively with Iraqi authorities to catalogue losses, recover stolen items where possible, and support the training of new generations of Iraqi archaeologists and museum professionals dedicated to protecting this irreplaceable heritage going forward. Despite these setbacks, significant discoveries have continued to emerge. Excavations at the ancient site of Girsu, associated with the war god Ninurta, have uncovered temple structures and administrative archives providing new detail about how individual Sumerian city-states organized worship of specific Anunnaki deities differently from one another, reinforcing just how much local variation existed beneath the broader, shared framework of Mesopotamian religion. Similarly, ongoing digital and digitization projects have made vast collections of previously untranslated cuneiform tablets held in museum archives around the world, newly accessible to researchers and even to members of the public, dramatically accelerating the pace at which new translations and new details about the Anunnaki continue to emerge. Recent excavation seasons at Girsu have specifically uncovered a well-preserved temple structure dedicated directly to Ninurta, complete with an associated archive of administrative tablets detailing offerings, festival schedules, and the organization of temple personnel responsible for maintaining his cult across multiple generations. This kind of granular, city-specific detail adds genuine texture to the broader timeline, covered throughout tonight's video, allowing researchers to move beyond the general, pantheon-wide narrative and examine precisely how a single specific temple, dedicated to a single specific member of the Anunnaki, actually functioned as a day-to-day religious and administrative institution across the practical, lived experience of the priests, farmers, and craftsmen who depended on it. Major museum collections in London, Berlin, Paris, and Chicago hold hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets that have never been fully translated or published, simply due to the sheer scale of material recovered during the initial waves of 19th and early 20th century excavation, combined with the relatively small number of scholars trained in the specialized skills needed to read this ancient script fluently. Ongoing digitization initiatives, including collaborative international projects that photograph and catalogue tablets in high resolution for online access, have begun to address this backlog, allowing researchers scattered across the globe to examine and cross-reference material that would previously have required an expensive and time-consuming visit to a specific physical archive. University departments specializing in Assyriology, though relatively small in number compared to departments dedicated to more widely studied ancient civilizations like Greece or Rome, continue to train new generations of scholars capable of reading Sumerian, Akkadian, and the various related languages preserved across this vast body of cuneiform literature. Graduate students entering this field today often specialize in narrow subsets of the surviving material, focusing specifically on administrative records from a particular city and period, or on religious hymns from a specific temple archive, gradually building toward the kind of comprehensive, cross-referenced understanding of the entire Anunnaki timeline that this video has attempted to summarize across a single evening's viewing. Modern linguistic and computational tools have also begun assisting scholars in cross-referencing thousands of tablets simultaneously, identifying patterns and connections between different versions of the same myths that would have taken individual researchers entire careers to piece together manually in earlier decades. This ongoing, methodical work continues to refine and occasionally revise our understanding of exactly how concepts like the Anunnaki evolved across different cities and centuries, adding nuance to the broad timeline we've covered throughout this video without fundamentally overturning the core historical narrative established by generations of careful scholarship. It's this continued active process of discovery that makes the actual documented history of the Anunnaki so much richer than any single fixed interpretation could ever capture, ancient or modern. Every new tablet translated adds another voice to a conversation that began roughly 5,000 years ago in the temples of Uruk and Nippur, a conversation about kingship, mortality, justice, and the relationship between humanity and the forces believed to govern the world, one that has never actually stopped, even if the specific gods being discussed have changed dramatically across the intervening millennia. Stepping back across everything covered tonight, it's worth appreciating just how unusual the Anunnaki's journey through human memory actually is compared to most other ancient religious traditions. Most pantheons from the ancient world faded gradually into obscurity, remembered only by specialists, referenced occasionally in footnotes, discussed primarily within university lecture halls rather than in popular culture. The Anunnaki instead experienced something closer to a genuine second life, rediscovered first by careful 19th century philologists piecing together a forgotten religious system from broken clay fragments, and then rediscovered a second time in an entirely different form by a popular audience captivated by questions about extraterrestrial visitors and hidden history. Both of these rediscoveries, the careful academic one and the far more speculative popular one, ultimately trace back to the exact same body of physical evidence. The same clay tablets, the same cuneiform script, the same handful of ancient cities whose ruins still sit beneath the sands of modern Iraq. What differs is simply the lens through which that evidence gets interpreted, and understanding both lenses, the rigorous scholarly reconstruction and the more speculative modern reinterpretation, gives a genuinely complete picture of why this particular word, out of the thousands of terms preserved across the entire body of surviving Mesopotamian literature, became the one that captured the imagination of millions of people who have never read a single Sumerian tablet themselves. Somewhere in modern Iraq tonight, the mud brick foundations of Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, Ur, and Nineveh still lie beneath the earth, largely unexcavated, holding within them thousands of tablets yet to be uncovered and translated, quite possibly containing entire passages about these same Anunnaki that no living person has read in over 2,000 years. Every new excavation season and every newly digitized archive made accessible to researchers scattered around the globe carries the genuine possibility of recovering some fragment of this ancient timeline that has been silent since before the fall of Nineveh itself. A humbling thought when you consider just how much of humanity's earliest recorded religious imagination still remains buried, waiting patiently in the dark for the next generation of scholars to bring it, once again, back into the light. From the earliest temple hymns praising An and Enlil, through the Labour Rebellion that led to humanity's creation, through Marduk's cosmic battle and reorganization of the divine hierarchy, through the underworld judges who condemned even a goddess as powerful as Inanna, through the buried libraries of Nineveh, and finally into the modern theories that transformed this ancient word into a global phenomenon, the timeline of the Anunnaki spans nearly the entire history of human civilization itself. Whether understood as gods, as judges, or reinterpreted by modern theorists as something else entirely, the Anunnaki remain one of the oldest and most consequential concepts that any civilization has ever left behind for the rest of us to discover, translate, and continue arguing about, more than 5,000 years after the first scribe pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and recorded their name for the very first time. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.